Rechlin Test Center north of Berlin. August 1940. A grass airfield under low clouds in the Mecklenburg Lake Country. A Hawker Hurricane sits on the apron with a black cross painted on its side. 6 weeks earlier, this aircraft was on a French airfield wearing RAF roundels. Now it wears the Balkenkreuz of the Luftwaffe, and the man walking out to it is the most accomplished fighter pilot in Europe. Major Werner Moelders, 27 years old, with 25 victories already from Spain, and he is at this moment Commodore of Jagdgeschwader 51. He has been ordered to fly this captured British fighter, then to fly his own Messerschmitt Bf 109 against it, then write down what he finds. He climbs into the cockpit. The instruments are calibrated in feet and miles per hour. The stick is light at neutral and heavier than he expects under load. He notices a quirk almost immediately. When he pushes the stick forward sharply, the engine coughs. The carburetor cuts. His own fuel-injected Daimler-Benz would not do that. He files the observation away. Later, this will become a tactic in the squadron training manuals. Dive away from a hurricane with negative G. The British cannot follow. Listen to what Moelders writes when he lands. He does not despise the aircraft. He says it is, in his exact words, good-natured. He says it turns well. He says it is childishly easy to take off and land. And then he writes the sentence that will be circulated to every Luftwaffe fighter unit in France within weeks. Its performance is decidedly inferior to that of the ME-109. Decidedly inferior. Pause on that sentence because as Werner Moelders is writing those words at Rechlin, the same aircraft is shooting down more of his colleagues than every other British defense combined. 656 Luftwaffe machines will fall to hurricanes during the Battle of Britain, 529 to the Spitfire. Roughly 60% of all fighter command kills taken by the aircraft Moelders has just dismissed. This is not a story about a fighter plane. This is a story about how the most professional air force in Europe looked at an aircraft, judged it correctly on every individual measurement, and got the most important question completely wrong. Part 1. The empire that knew it would win. To understand what Werner Moelders saw when he looked at the hurricane, let us go back not to the Polish campaign, nor even to Spain, but to a thinking style that had been hardening inside the Luftwaffe since 1935. Here is the assumption. Air power, in the view of Hermann Göring and his staff at the Luftwaffe High Command, had been demonstrated as the decisive weapon of modern war. Poland had proved it. Norway had proved it. France had proved it. In each campaign, the Luftwaffe had shattered the enemy air force in days, then turned its weight on the enemy army, then watched the German divisions walk in behind. 27 days for Poland, 63 days for the Low Countries and France. The model worked. The men who ran the Luftwaffe were not amateurs. Hermann Göring had himself flown in the Richthofen Squadron in 1918. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding Air Fleet 2, was a professional general staff officer of the old school. Field Marshal Hugo Sperl, commanding Air Fleet 3, had built the Condor Legion in Spain. Adolf Galland and Werner Moelders were the most combat-experienced fighter pilots in Europe. With operational hours their British opposite numbers could only dream of, they had earned the right to be confident. On the 16th of July, 1940, the head of Luftwaffe intelligence, Oberst Joseph Schmid, submitted a comparative study of RAF and Luftwaffe striking power. Schmid was known to his colleagues as Bayo. His document in time would be lumped together with a broader assessment called Study Blau, the Blue Study. The conclusion was unambiguous. The RAF, in Schmid's words, was inferior to the Luftwaffe in almost every department. Both British fighters were considered inferior to the Bf 109. The Hurricane he singled out particularly so. His assessment was not insane. It was based on available data. The problem was that it was 1,000 miles out of date. Schmid estimated Britain had perhaps 900 fighters, of which 675 were serviceable, The real fighter command figure was 622 serviceable, close enough. But he then took the next step. He estimated British monthly fighter production at around 250 aircraft. The actual figure for July 1940 was 496, 2.5 times his estimate. And in his entire assessment, the words chain, home, the British Coastal Radar Network, do not appear at all. Pause on that for a moment. The Chief of Luftwaffe. Intelligence wrote a comparative study of the Royal Air Force in July 1940 without mentioning radar. That is not a small mistake. That is a man writing about a chess game without noticing his opponent can see his pieces. But the technical comparisons in Schmid's report, the comparisons of aircraft type against aircraft type, those were not wrong. On paper, the Bf 109 was a superior aircraft to both the Hurricane and the Spitfire. It was faster in level flight. It climbed better at most altitudes. Its Daimler-Benz engine was fuel-injected, which meant it did not sputter under negative G-force. It carried 20mm cannons and machine guns. The British had only 8 rifle-caliber Brownings. By every single metric of fighter versus fighter, the German machine was simply superior. This is the point modern history skipped, but let's look at it honestly. The German assessment of the Hurricane in 1940 was, technically speaking, entirely correct. Werner wasn't wrong. Schmid wasn't wrong. The Hurricane was by every metric inferior to the Bf 109. The design was wrong. The Luftwaffe had built their entire strategy on a simple idea. Planes fight planes, and the superior aircraft wins. That model had worked over Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Sedan, because those enemies had no integrated air defenses, no radar, no ground-controlled interception, no real backup, and no aircraft industry capable of replacing lost planes in real time. The Luftwaffe had been comparing fighter against fighter. The British were about to force a different metric. Then there was the issue of time. On the 13th of August, an operation with the grand name Adlertag, or Eagle Day, would launch the main assault. Luftwaffe planners had assured Göring that British fighter command could be cleared from southeast England in 4 days. The entire RAF would fall in 4 weeks. 4 days. 4 weeks. Think about those numbers. The model worked in Poland, it worked in Norway, it worked in France. Surely it would work over the English Channel, and then over London. By the end of September, maybe even sooner, German troops in flat-bottom barges would be wading onto the beaches of Sussex. The plan had never failed until it did. Part 2. The aircraft no one was supposed to fear. The Hawker Hurricane was designed by a man named Sidney Camm, the son of a Windsor carpenter. He never attended university, starting his career as an apprentice crafting plane parts by hand. He rose to chief designer at Hawker in 1925, remaining there for over 40 years. His design philosophy was incredibly simple. He built aircraft that actually worked. When the British Air Ministry requested designs for a new monoplane fighter in 1934, Camm did something unique in Europe. He did not begin with engine specs or top speed figures. Instead, he started with the practical question: what could an RAF crew repair in a drafty Wiltshire hangar at 3 a.m? Let's pause there, because this is where the Battle of Britain was decided. Camm designed a steel tube fuselage, bolted rather than welded, because he distrusted welded metal under combat stress. He wrapped that framework wooden formers, stringers, and treated Irish linen. The front fuselage was metal paneled, and the wings eventually became all metal. The landing gear was wide-tracked, with wheels retracting inward into wing bays. Every single component was meant to be repaired in the field by a mechanic using basic hand tools. Camm did not build the most advanced fighter. He didn't even try. Reginald Mitchell at Supermarine was designing that masterpiece, the legendary Spitfire. But Camm built something different, a plane his country could afford to lose. If you love history, subscribe and look at these numbers. They tell a story top speeds do not. A Hurricane took 10,300 hours. A Spitfire took 15,002. The Hurricane was rearmed and refueled in 9 minutes between sorties. The Spitfire took 26 minutes, nearly 3 times longer. In an attritional battle measured in daily sorties per pilot, that is the difference between a fighter command that survived the autumn and one that fell. The prototype first flew at Brooklands on the 6th of November 1935, piloted by George Bullman. When Camm asked for his honest thoughts, Bullman responded in a phrase later quoted in the official military testing report: "The aircraft is simple to fly and has no apparent vices." Simple, with no vices. Those are not glamorous words. They are terms you use for a reliable tool, a wrench, or a rifle. By the summer of 1940, nearly 3,000 existed. The Hurricane outnumbered the Spitfire in fighter command by 3-2. In July, as Beppo Schmid wrote his report, England had 396 operational Hurricanes versus 228 Spitfires. By September, 33 squadrons flew Hurricanes against 19 flying Spitfires. Here is what the Luftwaffe pilots over Kent did not understand at first. The Hurricane's thick, fabric-covered wing acted as an incredibly stable gun platform. Its 8 Brownings were grouped tightly in 4s near the fuselage. When fired, the recoil did not torque the airframe sideways like the Spitfire's wider, wing-mounted guns did. That concentrated cone of fire was built for destroying bombers, which was exactly what mattered when they targeted British airfields, factories, and cities. The Hurricane was actually a more effective killer. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, who commanded No. 85 Squadron of Hurricanes during that, Townsend later wrote in his memoir Duel of Eagles that the Hurricane was a rock-solid platform for 8 Browning machine guns, though he freely admitted it lacked the speed and glamour of the Spitfire. He noted that German pilots even developed a snobbish preference for being shot down by Spitfires before writing this crucial sentence that deserves to be on every memorial. In the aggregate, the Hurricane would do greater damage to the Luftwaffe. In the aggregate, that is the phrase the Germans completely missed in their "Let us pause here, because this matters." Men like Peter Townsend and the ground crews serving those Hurricanes, around in 9 minutes, day after day in August and September of 1940, did not know if they were winning. They were utterly exhausted, burying comrades every week, yet they still flew the aircraft Moelders had called, good-natured into battle. With survival far from guaranteed, they kept taking off even after their friends were dead. Giving this video a like keeps the memory of these men and their 9-minute turnarounds alive for people. It costs nothing, but it truly matters. Let's get back to the aircraft. The first captured Hurricanes were pulled from fields in northern France during May and June of 1940. The RAF had sent 4 squadrons there at the outbreak of the war. By the time the army evacuated from Dunkirk, those squadrons had lost nearly all their planes. Some were shot down. Others ran out of fuel and crash-landed. Many were left completely intact as airfields were overrun. 178 Hurricanes were left behind. Think about that, because that represents almost half the operational strength of fighter command on the day the Battle of Britain began. At least 3 of those captured Hurricanes were shipped to Rechlin. One, its original British serial lost to history, was repainted in Luftwaffe, markings encoded DF plus GC. It was flown by Werner Moelders and his peers during comparative trials that produced the report we reviewed earlier. They tested it, wrote it up, and declared it inferior. But the men who once flew those planes, whom the Germans believed were already beaten, were about to show them what inferior actually meant. Part 3. The system the Luftwaffe could not see. Here is the question that should have been on Beppo Schmid's desk on the 16th of July, 1940, but was not. If the Bf 109 is superior, why was Britain still building Hurricanes? The answer is the most critical lesson of the entire battle, and it has nothing to do with aerodynamics. Britain kept building Hurricanes because they understood that a war between industrial powers is not won by the best aircraft. It is won by the planes you can replace. In June 1940, The British factories built 446 fighters. In July, 496. Meanwhile, Germany's entire industry managed only 240 fighters, less than half. Think about that, less than half. The man behind that miracle was Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian newspaper magnate whom Churchill appointed as Minister of Aircraft Production. Beaverbrook ran his ministry like a ruthless press room. He bullied factories and requisitioned alusu.com, NEOM. He slashed through procurement bureaucracy with a brutality that earned him many enemies but got the exact results Churchill needed. By late August, while Hermann Göring was telling his commanders that the British fighter force was finished, Beaverbrook's busy factories shipped replacement fighters faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. Indeed, active fighters rose from 644 in early July to 732 by October. It rose even while facing daily onslaughts from the largest air force on Earth. Now, look at this crucial statistic, the single number on which our entire case rests. According to official fighter command records after the battle, the Hurricane claimed 656 kills, while the Spitfire had 529. The Hurricane, the very plain Werner Moelders, dismissed as decidedly inferior, and which Beppo Schmid singled out as the weaker of Britain's two fighters, actually downed more Luftwaffe aircraft than all other British defenses. Combined, roughly 60% of all fighter command victories, 656. Let's look at what that truly represents. It means that on average, for every 2 German aircraft destroyed by Spitfires, the Hurricane downed 3. It means this wood-framed, fabric-covered, slower, lazier, supposedly inferior workhorse was, in the only metric that truly counted that summer, the deadliest weapon in the Western European sky, the Luftwaffe. They failed to see this because they were measuring the wrong metric. They were busy counting peak performance numbers. The British, however, were focused on bombers destroyed. Hurricanes excelled at downing bombers, and those bombers were trying to destroy Britain. Why couldn't the Germans copy this strategy? Why not construct a cheaper, simpler, mass-produced fighter? And could Germany outnumber the British in the air? They could not. Let's look at why. German manufacturing was built on precision engineering. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a beautiful machine with compound curves and stress skin construction. It required highly skilled labor. Willy Messerschmitt had built the exact aircraft his factories were optimized for building. In turn, German workers were trained only to construct what Messerschmitt designed. There was absolutely no industrial flexibility for a faster, cheaper alternative. Beppo Schmid's goal of 250 fighters monthly wasn't laziness. It was the maximum rate their precision engineering and labor system could actually sustain. Britain, meanwhile, possessed the Hurricane designed by Carpenter's son specifically for what an industrial nation at war could sustainably mass produce. Hurricanes were already rolling off Hawker's Kingston production lines, and there were more Hurricanes coming from Gloucester Aircraft in Brockworth. They were even being manufactured in Canada by Canadian Car and Foundry in Fort William. The design supervisor was Elsie McGill, the first female engineer in the world to design and build a fighter plane. That meant 3 separate assembly lines across 2 continents, producing an aircraft easily repaired with simple hand tools at any forward airfield by a novice mechanic. That is what an industrial democracy at war looks like. It was a massive machine. Werner Moelders completely overlooked when he climbed out of a captured Hurricane at Rechlin and labeled it inferior. The German industry was building a better fighter, but the British were building a better war. Let's pause on that statement because it sums up the entire conflict. If your father, grandfather, or great-uncle served on a Hurricane, Squadron in 1940, worked on a Hawker line, or watched the Battle of Britain from a post in Kent, or Sussex or South London, share their names in the comments. Please subscribe to our channel to preserve these stories. Their memory survives through us, so please hit that like button. Every single pilot in those cockpits had a name. The mechanics had names. The women on the lines had names. If you know a name, post it. Honor lives through naming them, and there is no other way. Part 4. What Werner Moelders misunderstood. By the third week of Niedersachsen, August 1940, the Luftwaffe High Command began to notice something that contradicted Beppo Schmid's report. The Royal Air Force was supposed to be finished, but it wasn't. The estimates predicted 4 days, but after Eagle Day on August 13th, then the hardest day on the 18th, the Luftwaffe lost over 120 aircraft in less than a single week. Yet they still faced fighter resistance over every target. Adolf Galland, then commanding Jagerschwader 26 on the Channel coast, watched this massive discrepancy in his logs every evening. Galland was no fool. He was sharp, and he saw exactly what was unfolding. He knew the Bf 109 was the superior dogfighter. Yet, he was losing pilots to Hurricanes at a rate that made absolutely no sense under Schmid's equations. The conversation that followed has become legendary, and like most myths, it has been polished into a narrative it never actually had. In the movie made decades later, Galland is shown demanding, quote, "Give me a squadron of Spitfires." But what he actually wrote in his 1953 memoir titled The First and the Last was much milder and far more revealing. When Reich Marshal Goering asked what equipment his group needed, Galland replied that he would like a squadron of Spitfires. The real point of this request is not what most people assume. Galland never believed the Spitfire was the superior fighter. He went out of his way to emphasize that the Bf 109 was superior in attack. He was simply asking for a fighter better suited to the close escort role. Goering forced upon them a role that completely wasted the plane's strengths. It was a protest about tactics, not the aircraft itself. But look closely at what is missing from that quote. Galland never once asked for a squadron of Hurricanes. The Luftwaffe's most decorated fighter ace, who finished the war with 104 confirmed victories, watched the very aircraft that was slaughtering his men. Yet, he didn't even deem it worthy of mentioning by name. This blind spot is what truly haunts the German narrative. They were correct about the technical specs, they were correct about the strengths of the Bf 109, and that the Spitfire was the deadlier British fighter in a direct one-on-one duel. But they asked the wrong question entirely. They focused on which aircraft was technically superior. The British asked which industrial system could win the war, while Galland drafted his tactical protest to Goering. A 23-year-old flight lieutenant named James Brindley Nicolson was on his very first combat patrol over Southampton. The date was August 16th, 1940, and he flew a Hurricane. Look at plane P-3576, Squadron 249. Hear his story because it reveals what the Luftwaffe never understood about pilots flying these supposedly inferior planes. Then, 4 cannon shells struck his Hurricane in rapid succession. One pierced the cockpit canopy, wounding his eye. Another hit his left foot. A third struck the fuel tank, igniting a fire. His instrument panel shattered, the cockpit filled with flames. By any logical measure, he was finished. He started to bail out. Yet, in those seconds, while he was climbing out of a burning plane with a shattered foot and a blinded eye, he saw a German fighter cross his gun sight. He climbed back into the cockpit, sitting directly in the flames. He took aim, fired, and shot the German down. Only then did he bail out, his hand so badly burned the skin, peeled in sheets, only to be shot in the leg by a Home Guard volunteer on the ground who mistook him for a Luftwaffe pilot. He became the sole fighter command pilot in the entire Second World War to receive the Victoria Cross. The official citation published in the London Gazette on the 15th of November 1940 records only that he destroyed an enemy fighter from a burning cockpit. Please subscribe. Let us pause on James Nicolson. At Rechlin, Werner Moelders climbed out of a captured Hurricane and looked at the Prosa's airframe. He did not consider the pilots who would fly it. Meanwhile, Nicolson was being treated for severe burns at the Royal Berkshire Hospital. A completely different group of pilots was assembling into a brand new squadron at Northolt. They were Polish. Having lost their nation in 1939 and watched France collapse in 1940, they wanted one thing only: to fly against the Luftwaffe once more. The RAF made them learn English before placing them in Hurricanes and assigning them the designation 303. This squadron flew its first combat mission on August 30th, 1940. Over the next 42 days, Squadron 303 destroyed 126 German aircraft. Pause on that incredible number. The top scoring pilot of the entire Battle of Britain, flying any aircraft for either side, was not British. He was a Czech sergeant named Josef František, flying Hurricane R4175 with the Polish squadron. He downed 17 Luftwaffe planes in 6 weeks. Before his tragic death in an accident on October 8, 1940, Air Chief Marshal Hugh, Dowding, the mastermind behind Fighter Command, later wrote in his official dispatch that without the magnificent Polish squadrons and their unmatched gallantry, he hesitated to declare that the ultimate victory would have been the same. The Luftwaffe had counted the enemy planes, but they failed to count men like these. Part 5. The Verdict. Let us return to Werner Moelders at Rechlin in August of 1940, climbing from the captured Hurricane and writing the word inferior in his evaluation report. He was right. The Hurricane was slower than the Bf-109. It climbed worse, carried lighter armament, and its carburetor cut out under negative gravity. On every technical point Moelders measured that morning at Rechlin, his findings were sound. And yet he was wrong. He failed because he evaluated only the machine, whereas the truly critical question was about the nation behind it. Germany built a better fighter, but Britain waged a better war. They had faster aircraft, but Britain had planes that returned tomorrow. Germany relied on Willy Messerschmitt, while Britain had Sidney Camm. The German metric was speed, the British metric was sorties. That was the reality that broke the Luftwaffe, not the report written at Rechlin in August. It was the brutal truth found in the casualty reports of German fighter and bomber wings by late October. 656 enemy planes destroyed by the unheralded Hurricane. Over half of all fighter command kills. It was the plane no German pilot would have asked Göring for, and the machine that, more than any other single piece of equipment, kept German forces out of England. As historians, let us examine the facts honestly, because the Hurricane had severe flaws that cost lives. It could not catch a Bf-109 in level flight. It could not protect itself from high-speed dive attacks. Hurricane pilots burned inside wood and fabric fuselages, whereas Spitfire pilots in metal-skinned planes might have survived. The famous Burns unit at East Grinstead, where Surgeon Archibald McIndoe rebuilt the charred faces of young pilots whose cockpits caught fire, exists partly due to a known design weakness. That must never be forgotten, yet the ultimate historical verdict stands. The Hurricane was never the best fighter in the sky, nor the fastest, nor the most beloved. Yet it was the machine that won the battle. Let us remember their names. Flight Lieutenant James Nicolson, Victoria Cross recipient, who climbed back into a burning Hurricane to down an enemy plane, only to die on operations in another aircraft over the Bay of Bengal in May 1945. And Sergeant Josef František, the Czech ace with 17 kills, who died in a hurricane accident at UL on the 8th of October, proved fatal. Yet squadron leader Peter Townsend knew his aircraft was less glamorous than the Spitfire, yet chose to write about it anyway. Sir Sidney Camm, who never attended university, was the designer whose pragmatism built a warplane Britain could actually afford to lose. Then there was Elsie McGill, who manufactured them in Canada, and Lord Beaverbrook, who produced them faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them, along with all the unnamed heroes. The ground crews who refueled and rearmed a Hurricane in just 9 minutes to send it back into the skies. The fitters who patched the torn fabric of a shot-up fuselage in a single afternoon. The working women on assembly lines at Brooklands, Brockworth, and Fort William. The brave pilots whose names are engraved on Battle of Britain memorials, and the unsung flyers whose names appear nowhere. They all built this aircraft Werner Moelders called good-natured, and flew the machine Adolf Galland never even bothered to mention. They won the ultimate air battle in a fighter the Luftwaffe judged decidedly inferior. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are so many more stories to tell. More aircraft, more designers, more commanders, and more men and women whose names must never be allowed to fade away. Think of Lancaster crews over the Ruhr, the codebreakers at Bletchley, or the Sea Hurricane pilots stationed on convoy escort carriers in the cold Atlantic. This epic history is not a tale of brilliant individuals. Instead, it is the story of a system that built ordinary men and unglamorous aircraft, then asked them to achieve the absolute impossible against the most professional military machine in Europe. They were all